I was 26 when I decided to take a short camping trip by myself in the summer of 2014. I had just moved back to Illinois after finishing a rough couple of years working out of state, and I wanted some quiet, away from everything. I grew up fishing with my dad, so I picked a place I knew, Shabbona Lake State Park. It wasn't too far from home, but it was quiet enough, especially if you set up away from the main campgrounds. I parked my old Chevy near the lot, strapped my pack, and walked a couple of miles off the marked trails. The heat was heavy that day, late July, the kind where even in the woods the air sticks to your skin. I carried enough gear for one night: a small tent, sleeping bag, a knife, my old flashlight, some jerky, trail mix, a little propane stove, and a quart of water. I didn't want to carry too much. The plan was simple: set up by the lake, fish until dark, sleep, then head home in the morning. By late afternoon, I found a quiet spot just above the shoreline. The ground was flat enough for my tent, and the trees blocked most of the wind coming off the water. I could hear cicadas buzzing from every direction, their high droning sound carrying over the lake. I set my tent, rolled out my bag, and placed my pack against a tree. I felt relaxed, like I'd finally stepped away from everything. As the sun dropped lower, the lake turned gold, and I sat on a log near the shore, tossing a line into the still water. I caught nothing, but it didn't matter. The surface reflected the fading sky, and the forest was calm except for the hum of insects. Around 8, I made a small fire from the dry sticks I had gathered earlier. The flames crackled, throwing small sparks up into the darkening air. I cooked some jerky on the pan just for warmth more than taste, then sat and ate while watching the fire dance. The night deepened quickly. I lay back and looked through gaps in the branches at the stars, feeling that mix of comfort and unease you only get when you're alone in the woods. I've always been cautious when I camp solo. My dad drilled that into me early. Always know where your knife is, always keep the fire controlled, always stay aware of sounds around you. It made me a little jumpy, but I figured that was better than careless. Around 11, the fire had burned down low. The woods were thick with sound. Frogs croaking near the lake, crickets, the occasional rustle of something small in the brush. I packed up the last bits of food, kicked some dirt over the fire, and crawled into the tent. The nylon walls felt thin, but they were all I had. I zipped the door and stretched out inside, knife within reach, flashlight by my head. I must have dozed off for about an hour when I woke suddenly. At first, I wasn't sure why. My eyes adjusted to the faint light seeping through the tent, and everything seemed quiet except the steady chirping of crickets. Then I heard it, a sound different from the small rustles I'd gotten used to. It was heavier, slow, deliberate steps in the brush. I held still, listening hard. The sound came from up the slope behind my tent. Not too close, but not far either. Each step cracked small branches or pressed into the leaves. It wasn't a deer, those moved lighter and quicker. This was steadier, heavier. I felt the hairs on my arms rise. I switched off my breathing, holding it in so I could listen better. The steps paused, then continued, this time shifting closer. I realized then that whoever or whatever it was, they were moving around me, not away. My mind started racing. Out here, it could be a stray hiker, but at midnight, moving quiet through brush with no light? That didn't make sense. I slid my hand to my knife and gripped the handle, not moving otherwise. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my ears. The steps circled wide, and I thought I heard the faint scrape of metal, like something brushing against a tree. My mouth went dry. For minutes, though it felt longer, I lay there listening. Then the sounds faded into the distance, swallowed by the night. I didn't move. I stayed like that, stiff and alert, until I realized the crickets had returned to their normal rhythm. Eventually, I convinced myself it might have been an animal, maybe even someone walking back to their campsite far off. But I couldn't shake the way those steps felt. They were too measured, too human. I didn't sleep after that. I sat up inside the tent, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other, staring at the zipper door. Every sound outside felt louder. Every brush of wind through the leaves felt like someone creeping closer. My back ached from sitting tense, but I didn't dare relax. The hours dragged. Around 3 or 4 in the morning, the woods went still again.
No crickets, no frogs.
Just silence. That quiet was worse than any noise. Then I caught another sound. This time it was softer, like someone dragging something lightly over the ground. A long scrape, then a pause. Then again. My chest tightened. I leaned forward, straining to hear. The sound came from the side of the tent, maybe 20 feet away, just beyond the thin fabric wall. I thought about unzipping the door, shining the light, but fear held me. If it was an animal, the light might spook it, but if it was a person, then I'd just give myself away. So I sat, frozen, gripping the knife until my hand went numb. The scraping stopped after a few minutes, or maybe I just couldn't hear it anymore. Either way, I didn't move until the first pale light of dawn finally bled into the tent. When the sun rose, I unzipped the door carefully and stepped out. The air was cooler, the ground damp with morning dew. I looked around, scanning the trees, the slope, everything. First, nothing seemed off. Then I noticed the dirt near the tent, just at the tree line. There were footprints, clear, heavy shoe prints pressed into the soft soil, circling around where I had slept. They weren't mine. Mine led from the lake to the tent, and that was it. These were different, larger, spaced wider apart. They came down the slope, stopped near the tent, then continued off toward the thicker woods. I crouched and counted them, following the path as far as I could before the prints faded into harder ground. That confirmed it hadn't been an animal. Someone had walked right up to where I was camping, lingered long enough to circle me, then slipped off into the night. I had been sitting a few feet away from whoever it was, separated only by the thin sheet of nylon. My stomach turned. I felt exposed, stupid for camping alone, stupid for letting myself think it was safe. I packed fast, rolling my bag, tearing down the tent with shaking hands. I didn't eat, didn't stop to fish. I stuffed everything into my pack, hoisted it onto my shoulders, and started back to the trailhead without looking back. The whole walk out, I kept checking behind me, every snapping twig making me jolt. The prints stuck in my mind, the way they circled, the way they stopped close before turning away. Whoever it was hadn't come to camp. They hadn't come to fish. They had come for me. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear into the trunk, slammed the lid, and sat inside with the doors locked, breathing hard. The morning sun lit the lot, and a few other campers pulled up with kids and coolers, laughing, getting ready for their day. It all felt wrong, too normal. I sat there for a while, gripping the steering wheel, waiting for my hands to stop shaking. That was the last time I camped alone. Even now, years later, I remember the sound of those steps circling my tent, slow and careful, and the prints in the dirt showing me I hadn't imagined it. There are things in the woods that aren't animals, and sometimes the scariest thing you can hear out there is the sound of another person moving quietly in the dark. I never really thought much about graveyards before. I'd walked through a few during the day, the way you might cut across one to save time, but I had never spent much time in one. It wasn't until the summer of 2017, when I was 24, that I decided to camp overnight in one. It wasn't for a dare or some thrill-seeking thing. It was just one of those impulsive ideas I had that I didn't talk myself out of. I was in a small town in northern Arkansas, staying with a cousin for a few days, and I had been hiking alone during the days. On my way back from one of those hikes, I passed this old graveyard just off a dirt road. It sat on a hill, surrounded by a rusted wire fence, the grass tall and uneven, headstones leaning at different angles. Something about it caught my attention. Felt isolated, quiet, forgotten. That night, lying awake in my cousin's guest room, the idea came to me that I should just camp there for one night. I told myself it would be just another camping story to carry with me. The next evening, I packed light. Just a one-man tent, a small sleeping bag, a flashlight, some water, a lighter, and a knife I always carried. I left after dinner so I wouldn't have to explain where I was going. The walk was about 40 minutes along the road, and when I reached the graveyard, the last bit of sun was still hanging low. The air was thick and warm, the kind of sticky summer night that doesn't cool down even after dark. The gate was nothing more than a section of fence bent down, so I stepped over it. The place looked different than it had in the daytime. The shadows stretched long, and the headstones seemed taller, closer together. Some were old and broken, names worn down to the point they couldn't be read. Others were newer, polished stone that caught what little light was left in the sky. I chose a spot near the back, close to a large oak tree where the ground was more level. I set up the tent quickly, trying to keep my mind focused on the routine of it. Poles, stakes, rainfly. I sat down after and drank some water, watching the last bit of daylight fade away behind the tree line. The graveyard grew quiet in a way I wasn't used to. When I camp in the woods, there's usually the sound of insects, animals, the rustle of leaves. Here, there was a kind of heavy silence that settled in, broken only by the occasional chirp of a cricket or the distant hum of cars far away on the highway. I laid down inside the tent with the flap open, just staring at the silhouettes of the headstones against the sky. After a while, I got that uneasy feeling that comes when you realize just how alone you are. I thought about the bodies buried all around me, how close I was to them, how the ground beneath me wasn't like any other patch of land I had camped on. My mind wandered to how long they had been there, who they had been, and what it would be like if anyone else saw me from outside the graveyard. Just a figure moving between the stones at night. It was around midnight when I heard the first sound that made me sit up. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp, like something snapping under pressure. A stick, or maybe the crunch of dry grass. It came from beyond the fence, on the side closest to the road. I sat there, listening, holding my breath. At first I thought it might be a deer or some stray dog, but then it came again. 2 quick steps, then silence. I turned off my flashlight, not wanting to draw attention. The moon was out, casting just enough light to see the outlines of things. My heart was beating harder now, and I could feel sweat on my back even though I was sitting still. I waited, listening, but nothing came after that. After a long time, I told myself it was probably just an animal and laid back down. Sleep didn't come easy. I kept drifting in and out, waking at every small noise. Once, I thought I heard the fence rattle, but when I looked out, nothing was moving. Another time, I swore I heard the sound of breathing close to the tent, but I told myself it was just the wind pushing through the grass. Still, I kept the knife in my hand inside the sleeping bag, just in case. It must have been close to 3 in the morning when I woke up to a different sound. This time it was the sound of metal clinking, like something tapping against one of the headstones. Not hard, but steady. A faint tap 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 that carried through the night. I froze, staring at the fabric of the tent above me. My mind was racing, trying to come up with any normal explanation, but I couldn't. I slowly unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The graveyard looked empty, but then I noticed movement near the far side, close to where the fence dipped. A figure. At first, I thought it might just be my eyes playing tricks in the moonlight, but then I saw it clearly. A person hunched over one of the headstones. I couldn't make out details, just a dark shape bending low, then straightening up, then bending again. The tapping sound matched the movements, like they were knocking something against the stone. I felt my stomach twist. My first thought was that it might be someone vandalizing the graves, but then I wondered why anyone would be doing that at 3 in the morning. My second thought was worse, that maybe they had seen my tent earlier and were trying to scare me. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, watching. After a few minutes, the figure stopped tapping and just stood there, facing my direction. Even from across the graveyard, I felt like their eyes were on me. I ducked back inside the tent, heart hammering in my ears. I knew I couldn't just sit there. If it was someone messing with me, they might come closer. If it was something worse, I didn't want to find out. I packed up as quietly as I could, rolling the sleeping bag in a rush and stuffing it into the pack. My hands were shaking, making every zipper and buckle sound louder than it should have. I left the tent behind. Carrying it would make too much noise, and I didn't care about it anymore. When I stepped out, the graveyard was still. The figure was gone, or at least I couldn't see it anymore. I moved quickly, crouching low, heading for the broken section of fence I had come through. Every few steps, I looked over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following. My legs felt heavy, but I forced myself to keep moving. I crossed the fence and got back onto the road. Only then did I allow myself to breathe fully. I walked fast, almost jogging, not stopping until I saw the first lights of houses at the edge of town. By the time I reached my cousin's place, the sky was starting to lighten with the first hint of morning. I never told him where I had been or what I saw. I didn't want the questions. The next day, I went back to get my tent in the daylight, but when I got there, it was gone. I walked the whole graveyard, checked every corner, but there was no trace of it. No footprints in the grass, no sign that I had even been there. I don't know who I saw that night or what they were doing. Maybe it was someone living out of the graveyard. Maybe it was some local person with a reason I'll never understand. All I know is that I was out there alone, and I wasn't supposed to see it. That was the last time I ever thought camping in strange places was a good idea. I was 19 when my dad invited me on a camping trip with one of his old friends, a retired Army sergeant named Mark. He was in his mid-50s, tough-looking but quiet, the kind of man who had a sharp presence even when he wasn't saying much. My dad had known him since high school, but I'd only met him a handful of times at family gatherings. He carried himself differently than most people I knew, calm but alert, like he was always waiting for something to happen. We went out to a remote area in the northern woods of Michigan in the summer of 2014. The place wasn't a state park or a common campsite. It was deeper, land that people rarely went to unless they hunted or cut timber. We drove up in 2 trucks, mine following behind my dad's, bouncing on dirt trails that got narrower the farther we went. When we finally stopped, the silence was heavy. No road noise, no planes overhead, just the sound of wind in the trees and the occasional snapping of branches under our boots. The first day was nothing strange. We set up camp near a clearing with a small stream running down the slope. My dad and I pitched the tent while Mark gathered wood. He worked methodically, every move practiced like muscle memory from years of doing things with precision. That night we sat by the fire, ate canned food, and watched the stars. The air felt clean and sharp, cooler than I expected for July. I fell asleep that night thinking it would be an ordinary trip. The second night changed everything. I woke up around 2 in the morning to the sound of movement outside the tent. At first, I thought it was just deer, since we'd seen a few the day before. But the sound was heavier, slower, deliberate. Leaves crunching, sticks snapping softly. I froze, listening. The air felt colder than it had when I'd fallen asleep. My dad was out cold beside me, his breathing steady. I wanted to nudge him awake, but I stayed still, trying to figure out if I was just imagining it. Then I heard something else, like a slow exhale, not animal-like, but human. My stomach dropped. The steps circled the tent once, then faded off toward the trees. I lay there stiff, eyes open in the dark, waiting for it to come back. My pulse hammered in my neck. Eventually, I heard nothing but the wind again. I told myself it had to be another camper, maybe someone hunting or passing through, but I knew how far off the main trails we were. Nobody would just stumble into our camp this deep at night. In the morning, I didn't say a word. I wasn't sure if I dreamed it, and I didn't want to sound paranoid. Mark, though, was different that day. He walked the edge of the camp slowly after breakfast, scanning the ground. He didn't say what he was looking for, but I saw him pause once, staring at the dirt near the trees. He stood there a long moment before turning back. His face gave nothing away. That night, Mark insisted on keeping the fire lower. He said it was to save wood, but I noticed how he sat differently, not relaxed but angled toward the dark like he was waiting. My dad didn't pick up on it, but I did. When night came, I had trouble sleeping. Around the same hour, I heard the same sounds again. Steps outside, slower this time, almost dragging. I forced myself to peek through a tiny slit in the tent. At first, I saw nothing but the faint outline of the trees against the dim starlight. Then my eyes adjusted, and I caught sight of a figure standing near the fire pit. It wasn't an animal. It was a man. He was tall, with broad shoulders, wearing dark clothing. He stood there motionless, just watching the tent. I held my breath, afraid he'd notice the movement of the flap. My chest ached from holding it in, but I didn't dare move. After what felt like forever, he slowly stepped back into the woods and disappeared. My hands were shaking so badly that I couldn't close my eyes the rest of the night. The next morning, Mark was awake before me. He had a small pistol holstered at his side now, one I hadn't seen before. He didn't announce it, just wore it openly while making coffee. My dad didn't even question it. Mark had that kind of presence. If he did something, it was for a reason. We spent the day hiking, fishing a little, trying to pass time, but I couldn't shake the image of that man. I kept glancing at the tree line, half expecting to see him standing there. I noticed Mark scanning too, though he tried to make it subtle. The air felt heavier, as if we were waiting for something we couldn't avoid. That night, everything escalated. I lay awake again, my nerves shot. Around 1 in the morning, the sounds returned, heavier now, closer, with no attempt at being quiet. Sticks cracked loud underfoot. I could feel the ground faintly tremble from footsteps. Then came a noise that froze me. Metal scraping on metal, like a blade brushing against something. Mark moved before I could even react. He unzipped the tent halfway and slid out silently, pistol in hand. My dad stirred but stayed put, half asleep. I lay there, heart slamming, listening. A few moments later, I heard a voice. Low, angry, words I couldn't make out. Then Mark's steady tone, firm but calm, not raised. There was no yelling, just short exchanges. Then silence. The silence stretched so long it felt unbearable. Finally, Mark came back. He crouched by the tent, zipped it, and sat just inside. His face was tight, jaw locked. He didn't say what happened, and I didn't ask. None of us slept the rest of the night. At first light, Mark insisted we pack up. My dad went along with it, though he seemed confused. I just moved as fast as I could, eager to leave. While tearing down the tent, I noticed something carved into one of the nearby trees, fresh and rough. It was a symbol almost like an arrow or a crude cross. The bark around it was pale from being stripped. I didn't mention it, just worked faster. We drove out in silence, dust kicking up behind the trucks as the woods closed in on both sides. The farther we got from the campsite, the easier I felt I could breathe. When we finally hit paved road again, Mark pulled his truck to the side and told my dad he'd meet us back at the house later. He didn't explain why. He just gave me a sharp look, one that said not to talk about it. I never did. To this day, I don't know who that man was or what he wanted. Maybe he was living out there off the grid and saw us as intruders. Maybe he was more dangerous than that, someone who hunted people instead of animals. What stuck with me most wasn't the sight of him standing by our fire, it was the way Mark reacted. Calm, controlled, prepared. He'd dealt with things like that before, I could tell. That trip made me realize something important. The wilderness isn't scary because of the dark, or the silence, or even the animals. It's scary because you never know who else might be out there, watching, waiting, deciding what to do with you. I never went camping that far out again. I was 27 when I decided to take a solo hunting trip deep into the mountains of northern Montana. It was October 2016, and the air was already carrying that sharp edge of winter that cuts through your clothes no matter how many layers you wear. I had been hunting since I was a teenager, usually with friends or family, but that year I wanted to go alone. Maybe it was pride, maybe stubbornness. I had convinced myself I needed the quiet, a break from the steady noise of the town and the endless churn of work. I drove up an old logging road for nearly 2 hours until the gravel thinned into ruts. I parked my truck in a small pull-off and hiked in with my pack, rifle slung over my shoulder. The trail was nothing more than a deer path, winding through heavy pines and open clearings where the grass had browned and fallen flat from frost. It was the kind of place where you felt both small and invisible, swallowed by the forest. I set up camp about 5 miles in, close to a creek where the water ran shallow over rocks. My tent was simple, just enough to keep out the cold. After pitching it, I gathered wood, built a fire pit, and sat there for a long while listening to the sound of water and wind moving through the branches. Felt good at first, isolated but peaceful. The first day passed quietly. I tracked a few sets of deer prints, but the wind wasn't in my favor and I never got close enough for a shot. That night, the temperature dropped hard. The fire kept me warm, but every time it died down, the cold pressed against the tent like it was trying to seep inside. I didn't sleep much, just drifted in and out, listening to the forest settle and shift. The second day, I woke up to thin frost on the ground. My breath hung in the air like smoke. I boiled some instant coffee, ate jerky, and packed light for the morning hunt. I moved up into higher ground, following game trails that cut through heavy brush. Around noon, I saw fresh elk tracks, big ones, still sharp-edged in the mud. My pulse jumped. I followed them deeper until the ground leveled out in a clearing. I crouched low, listening. That's when I noticed something strange. The woods were quiet, too quiet. Usually, you hear something out there. Birds, squirrels, the wind breaking against branches. But it was dead silent. The kind of silence that makes your skin prickle. I held still, scanning the tree line, rifle ready. Nothing moved. Eventually, I told myself I was overthinking it, but the feeling didn't shake off easily. As the day wore down, I turned back toward camp. By the time I got there, the light was already fading into that gray-blue shadow before night. I built the fire up again, cooked a can of beans, and sat there eating in the orange glow. The silence from earlier kept bothering me. It had been thick, heavy, like something was out there watching. I tried to tell myself it was just the weight of being alone, but the thought nagged at me. That night, just after I zipped into my sleeping bag, I heard it. Footsteps. At first, I thought it might be a deer or elk moving through the brush, but these weren't the sharp, quick steps of an animal. They were slower, more deliberate. Crunch, pause, crunch. They circled the tent, not close, but close enough that I could hear the leaves and twigs underfoot. My chest tightened. I reached for the rifle beside me, fingers brushing cold steel. The footsteps stopped after a while. I stayed awake for hours, listening, waiting for them to return. They never did. I must have drifted off sometime before dawn, because I woke to pale light spilling across the fabric of the tent. The third day was worse. I tried to hunt, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every twig snap behind me made me spin. I saw nothing, no person, no animal, but my nerves were raw. When I returned to camp that evening, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. My pack had been moved. It wasn't much, just shifted a foot or two from where I'd left it by the tent, but I knew I hadn't touched it. My food bag was unzipped, though nothing was missing. It was as if someone had opened it and closed it again, careful not to take anything. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept the fire burning high, rifle across my lap. Around 2 in the morning, I saw movement just beyond the firelight. A shape, tall and thin, standing still between 2 trees. My eyes strained against the dark. I thought maybe it was just a trick of the fire, shadows playing tricks, but then it moved. Slow, steady, like it wasn't in a hurry at all. I raised the rifle, but the figure slipped back into the trees, out of sight. I sat there, heart pounding, waiting for it to return. Didn't. By dawn, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed quickly, shoving everything into my bag with shaking hands. The woods felt wrong now, heavy with a presence I couldn't explain. I started back down the trail, trying to keep a steady pace, but every so often I heard it again. Footsteps behind me, not close, not far, just following. When I reached the truck, relief washed over me so hard I almost dropped my gear. I tossed everything into the back, slid behind the wheel, and turned the key. The engine roared to life. As I pulled out of the clearing, I glanced once into the treeline. Someone was standing there. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes, face pale against the shadows. He didn't move, didn't shout, just stood and watched as I drove away. I didn't stop until I was halfway back to town. My hands were stiff on the wheel, my throat dry. I kept replaying the last 3 nights over and over. The footsteps, the moved pack, the figure by the fire. None of it felt like a hallucination. It was real. I never went back to that spot. I don't hunt alone anymore, not deep in the mountains. Some things out there don't want to be found. And sometimes, it isn't the animals you need to be afraid of. It's the people who know you're alone. I was 24 when I went camping alone in the high desert of northern New Mexico. It was late October of 2017, right when the weather turns cold but before the first heavy snow hits. I had been dealing with too much noise in the city, and I thought a few quiet nights under the stars would clear my head. I packed light, just a tent, a small gas stove, a lantern, food, water, and a .22 rifle I carried more out of habit than necessity. I drove out of Santa Fe early in the morning, heading toward a spot I had been to only once before with a couple of friends. It was a few miles off the paved road, surrounded by juniper, pinyon pine, and those wide open spaces that seemed to stretch on forever. The last few miles were rough dirt, with deep ruts carved by summer rains. By the time I reached the flat clearing where I planned to set up camp, my truck was coated in dust, and the sun was hanging low. I got my tent up quickly, the fabric snapping in the wind as the temperature dropped. The place felt empty in a way that was both peaceful and unsettling. No traffic noise, no voices, no houses nearby. Just the occasional scrape of wind across the dry brush and the distant calls of coyotes. I cooked a quick meal, ate, and then walked around the area until the last bit of daylight disappeared behind the mesas. That first night, I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the silence. It wasn't complete silence. There was the usual night life. Crickets, a few owls, and the coyotes yipping far off. Still, it was the kind of quiet that presses against your ears, the kind that makes you hyper-aware of every small sound. I drifted off around midnight, but woke up sometime in the night to a noise I couldn't place. It wasn't a coyote, wasn't an owl. It was closer, a sound like footsteps crunching slowly over gravel and dry leaves. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a stray cow from one of the nearby ranches. I kept still and listened. The steps came closer, then stopped just outside my tent. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I held my breath, waiting for the zipper to move or the fabric to shift. But after a long minute, the sound faded. Whoever or whatever it was walked off into the brush. I barely slept after that. At first light, I crawled out of the tent and looked around. There were tracks near the edge of camp, but they were strange. They looked like human footprints, but the size was odd, longer than mine, the toes spread wider. They weren't clear enough to be certain, but they didn't look right. The second day, I tried to push it out of my head. I went on a long hike through the red dirt canyons, carried my rifle just in case, and tried to enjoy the isolation. The land out there feels untouched, like it hasn't changed in hundreds of years. I saw a hawk circling above, a rabbit darting into the brush, and nothing else. By the time I returned, the sun was going down again. I made a small fire, cooked beans and rice, and sat watching the flames until the cold drove me into my tent. That night was worse. I had just started to drift when I heard the same footsteps. Slow, crunching. This time I didn't pretend it was an animal. The steps circled my tent, deliberate, like someone was pacing around it. I stayed completely still, gripping my rifle, every muscle tight. The sound went on for what felt like forever, then stopped. I lay there in silence, waiting, but the night stretched on. At some point, exhaustion won and I slept. When I stepped out at dawn, I froze. Just beyond the ring of my campfire, there were prints in the dirt again. Clearer this time, bare feet, two long toes spread almost like fingers. They circled the tent, looping back on themselves. And there were drag marks too, like something had crouched low and used its hands to move. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but part of me didn't want to give in to fear. I convinced myself it was some local messing with me, maybe trying to scare me off. It didn't make sense, but it was easier to believe than the alternatives. The third day dragged on, every sound making me jump. The wind through the branches sounded like whispers, the crows overhead like warnings. By late afternoon, clouds rolled in, heavy and dark. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain and something else. Something sour, like rotting meat, came and went, but it stuck in my mind. That night, the storm broke. Lightning flashed over the mesas, thunder echoing like rolling drums. I sat in my tent, lantern off, rifle in my lap. The rain hammered the fabric, and for a while it drowned out every other sound. Then, between the thunder, I heard it again. Footsteps, but heavier this time. Slow, dragging. They stopped right outside the tent. The fabric pressed inward like a hand, or something like a hand, was brushing against it. I froze. The outline wasn't right. The fingers looked too long, the palm too narrow. It dragged across the tent wall, circling, pausing at the zipper. My breath caught. I sat there in the dark, waiting, and then I heard something that nearly made me drop the rifle. It was my name, whispered, stretched out, almost human but not quite. The voice cracked like someone trying to use vocal cords that didn't work the way they should. I couldn't take it anymore. I ripped open the zipper and shined my flashlight into the storm. For a split second, I saw something at the edge of the beam. It was crouched low, skin pale against the dark, limbs too long, head cocked at an unnatural angle. Its eyes caught the light and glowed back, flat and animal-like. Then it moved, faster than anything should, and was gone into the brush. I stood there shaking, rain soaking through my clothes, flashlight beam cutting through the storm. Nothing, just the sound of the wind and thunder. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I packed everything into the truck, hands trembling so bad I dropped gear more than once. I didn't even bother folding the tent. I just threw it all in the back and gunned the engine down the dirt road, fishtailing in the mud until I hit pavement. When I finally got back to Santa Fe, I sat in my apartment for hours, still hearing the sound of those footsteps in my head. I told myself it was just some person, someone messing around, but I knew, deep down, that what I saw wasn't a person, not the way we understand it. I never went back to that spot. Even now, years later, I still think about it whenever I hear footsteps at night, or when the wind picks up that sour smell. People can laugh and say it's just stories, but I know what I saw, and I know how it felt standing there in the dark with something circling my tent. The worst part isn't that it was out there. The worst part is knowing it knew my name. I was 24 when I took a solo trip through Central Europe, carrying little more than a backpack, a tent, and a cheap map. I wanted to move away from the noise of the cities and spend some nights in the wilderness. Austria had always pulled me in. Its tall mountains, green valleys, and the quiet that feels different from anywhere else. That summer, in July of 2016, I found myself in the Tyrol region, hiking alone through stretches of forest that felt endless. By late afternoon one day, I was exhausted. I had walked for hours with the sun hot on my back, sweat running down under my shirt, and my legs starting to feel heavy. The trail wound uphill, then down into a valley where a small stream cut through. I decided it was a good place to stop. The air there was cooler, and I could hear the water running, steady and calm. I dropped my pack, drank deeply, and found a flat patch of grass near some birch trees where I could set up my tent. The evening felt normal. I boiled a packet of rice on my little stove, sat by the water, and listened to the wind pushing through the trees. The smell of damp earth and pine was strong. When the light faded, I zipped myself inside my tent, pulled my sleeping bag around me, and let the exhaustion drag me into sleep. Sometime in the night, I woke up without knowing why. My eyes opened to pitch black, the kind of dark you only find deep in the woods. I stayed still, half asleep, listening. At first, there was nothing, just the normal sounds of the forest. Then I realized the hairs on my arms were standing up. I could hear footsteps, slow, deliberate. They weren't animal sounds. They were too heavy, too uneven, with the weight of someone walking on two legs. I froze. My tent was thin nylon, useless as protection, and my flashlight was buried in my pack by the door. The footsteps came closer, crunching over sticks, pausing, then moving again. My breathing grew shallow as I lay completely still, trying not to make a sound. After what felt like minutes, I dared to shift slightly, reaching for the flashlight. My hand shook as I flicked it on, but I kept it pressed against my chest, not yet pointing it outward. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. My heart thumped so hard I thought it would give me away. Then I heard it again, this time on the other side of the tent. Slow steps circling me. I could hear breathing, faint but real, just outside the thin fabric wall. I clenched my jaw and finally aimed the light through the mesh window. The beam cut across the trees, shaking in my hand. That's when I saw him. A man was standing about 10 feet away, half in the shadows. His clothes were ragged, dark pants, a jacket even though the summer night was warm. His hair was long and unkempt, hanging over part of his face, and his posture was strange, stiff, with his arms hanging too loosely at his sides. He wasn't moving, just staring at the tent. The light caught his eyes for a second, and they flashed pale, reflecting back at me. Every instinct in me screamed to get out, to run, but I couldn't. My body locked up. I turned off the flashlight immediately, plunging myself back into the dark. I hoped maybe he hadn't noticed the movement, though I knew he had. Minutes dragged on. I could hear my pulse in my ears. No footsteps now, just that awful waiting. Eventually, I heard the crunch of leaves again, but moving away this time, slower and slower, until it faded completely into the forest. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat upright in my sleeping bag, knife in hand, listening to every creak and rustle until the black sky turned gray. When daylight came, everything looked ordinary again. Birds chirped, the stream ran, the trees stood harmless. But the ground outside told a different story. In the dirt and moss around my tent, I saw footprints, long, wide steps circling close, then heading off deeper into the woods. They weren't mine. I packed quickly, skipping breakfast, stuffing everything into my pack with clumsy, shaking hands. The forest no longer felt peaceful. Every tree seemed to hide something. Every shadow carried weight. I hiked hard all morning, barely stopping for water, determined to put miles between me and that place. Around midday, I came to a clearing with an old wooden hunting cabin, weathered and abandoned. Curiosity pulled me closer. The door was open, and inside, the smell was sour, rotten. Empty cans, broken bottles, and a filthy blanket lay in a corner. The floor was littered with cigarette butts and scraps of paper. Someone had been living here recently. My stomach dropped when I noticed a torn piece of nylon fabric in the corner, the same color as tents I'd seen in shops. I didn't stay long. Fear clawed at me as I realized the man had probably been squatting out there, hiding in the woods, moving silently between places like this. Maybe he had watched other campers. Maybe worse. I pushed on, ignoring the ache in my legs, until I reached a small village by late afternoon. Seeing houses, cars, and people felt unreal after the night I just had. I sat on a bench near a bus stop, drained and unsteady, and only then did I realize how tense my body had been the whole day. That night, in a cheap hostel room, I replayed the images over and over. The man's stiff figure, the shine of his eyes in my light, the sound of his steps circling me. It was all too real. There was nothing supernatural about it, nothing mysterious. Just a stranger in the forest who had chosen to walk right up to me in the dark and stand there, watching. I never went camping alone again. Even years later, the thought of sleeping in a thin tent with only fabric between me and whoever or whatever might come close in the night fills me with the same unease. Austria was beautiful, but when I think back to that trip, I don't picture the mountains or the valleys. I picture that man in the dark, standing just a few feet away from where I lay, and the knowledge that I'll never know what he wanted or why he left. I was 23 the summer I decided to go camping alone in the mountains of northern Colorado. It was the summer of 2014, and I had been restless for weeks, working a boring job in town and spending most of my days stuck inside. I had grown up hiking and camping with my uncle, but I hadn't gone out alone before. I figured I could handle it. I had a decent tent, a sleeping bag that could handle cold nights, a cheap propane stove, and a small backpack of food. I wasn't planning on being out there longer than 2 nights. I drove out on a Thursday morning, taking old county roads that twisted higher into the mountains. The sky was a hard blue, no clouds, and the air got thinner the further I went. By mid-afternoon, I found a pull-off on the side of a dirt road and a faint trail that led downhill into a valley. I parked the car under some pines, loaded up my pack, and started walking. It was hot enough to make me sweat, but in the shadows of the trees, the air felt 10 degrees cooler. The spot I found to camp was about 1.5 miles down, near a creek that cut through a wide stretch of grass. There were old fire rings in the dirt, so I knew other people had camped there before, but it was empty that day. I set up my tent a little ways back from the water, under some spruce trees. It felt good to be away from people. All I heard was the rush of the creek, the sound of wind in the trees, and the occasional bird. I cooked a small dinner before the sun set, just beans and rice, then sat by the water until it got too dark to see. When I crawled into the tent, the ground felt hard under my sleeping pad, but I was tired enough that it didn't matter. I lay there listening to the night sounds, the gurgle of the creek, an owl far away, something small rustling in the grass. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a sound that wasn't normal. It wasn't an animal noise I recognized. It was heavy footsteps, slow, moving through the brush not far from my tent. I froze, listening. The steps stopped, then started again, closer. My heart started pounding. I told myself it could be a deer or maybe even an elk, but the steps were too careful, too deliberate. Animals crashed through the woods. This sounded more controlled, like someone trying not to make noise. I stayed still for almost an hour, just listening. The footsteps came and went, sometimes circling, sometimes further away. Eventually they faded, and I lay there in the dark, wide awake, waiting for morning. When daylight finally came, everything looked normal. There were no tracks around my tent, at least none I could see. I told myself I had overreacted, that maybe it was just an animal moving oddly. I ate some oatmeal and tried to relax. But when I walked a little up the trail that morning, I found something that made my stomach tighten. About 50 yards from camp, there was a tree with bark stripped away in long vertical marks. Not claw marks, scrapings like someone had dragged a knife or some metal tool down the trunk. The shavings of wood were fresh, still pale against the darker bark. I didn't like it. I went back to camp and spent the rest of the day close to my tent, fishing a little in the creek and reading from the paperback I'd brought. I kept looking up from the pages, scanning the tree line. I didn't see anyone. That night, it got worse. I hadn't even fallen asleep when I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, moving in a half circle around the tent. I lay flat, barely breathing. The steps stopped directly behind me, only a few feet away. Then there was silence. I could almost feel someone standing there, just watching. Minutes passed, then the sound of twigs snapping as the steps retreated. I finally forced myself to unzip the tent and shine my flashlight out into the trees, but the beam caught nothing but trunks and shadows. I barely slept the rest of the night. When the sun came up, I knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things as fast as I could, stuffing the sleeping bag and breaking down the tent with shaking hands. I was halfway through rolling the tent poles when I noticed something in the grass, just beyond where I had staked the lines. It was a boot print, a human boot print pressed deep into the dirt. It wasn't mine. The tread was different, and the size looked larger than my foot. Whoever it was had been standing right next to my tent. I didn't even bother making breakfast. I jammed everything into my pack and headed for the trail. My head kept swiveling left and right, checking the trees, every sound making me jump. At one point, I thought I saw movement, a flash of dark fabric between branches. But when I stopped to look, there was nothing there. By the time I reached the dirt road, my legs were burning, and I was sweating from more than just the climb. My car was parked in the same spot, but as I got closer, I saw something hanging from the driver's side mirror. It was a strip of bark, the same kind that had been stripped from that tree. Someone had tied it with twine into a loose knot and left it dangling from the mirror. I stood there staring at it, my mouth dry. The whole forest was quiet, like it was holding its breath. I threw my pack in the back seat, yanked the door open, and started the engine. Gravel sprayed as I floored it down the road. I didn't slow down until I hit the highway almost 30 miles later. I never went back to that spot. In fact, I didn't go camping alone again after that. I don't know who was out there with me those 2 nights, or why they stayed hidden instead of showing themselves, but I know they wanted me to realize they were there. The footprints, the scraping on the tree, the bark left on my car, it wasn't random. It was deliberate, and that's what made it terrifying. Someone had been watching me the entire time, close enough to touch my tent, close enough to follow me back to my car, and I'll never know what they wanted or how long they would have stayed if I hadn't left when I did.